The wind outside did not merely howl. It searched for every microscopic chink in our log walls with a predatory persistence. Pennsylvania winters in 1888 were forged from iron and sharpened by ice. History would soon call this the year of the Great White Hurricane. Inside our small kitchen, the air held a heavy, suffocating thickness. It was the scent of rendering tallow clashing with something far more ethereal and out of place. I sat at the heavy oak table, my fingers still stiff and cracked from the morning woodpile. The frost had bitten deep into my knuckles, leaving them raw and pulsing with a dull ache. In front of me sat a bowl of beef stew that felt like a hallucination in this drafty farmhouse. It was not the gray, watery gruel meant merely to sustain a body against the frontier. This was a harmony of time and a sophisticated whisper of red wine. It possessed a richness that belonged to the grand dining rooms of Philadelphia or New York. I took a slow, deliberate bite. Warmth bloomed in my chest like a long-forgotten memory of comfort. The beef was tender enough to surrender at the mere touch of a spoon. The broth was clear, deep, and layered with a complexity that felt like a secret language. Across the room, Martha leaned over a large iron pot on the wood-burning stove. She was placing a freshly baked meat pie onto the wooden table, brushing the golden crust with melted butter. The rich aroma of thyme and rosemary filled the kitchen. The steam dampening her stray hairs could not hide the inherent grace in her shoulders. She always moved as if she were hearing a piece of music I could never quite catch. She did not look like the other wives in the Susquehanna Valley. Their hands were often frantic, their movements heavy with the crushing weight of the wilderness. Martha moved with a precision that was almost surgical. Even when she was just skimming the surface of a pot, there was an unmistakable air of breeding. I watched the way she held the wooden paddle, her grip firm yet somehow elegant. Her silhouette was framed by the flickering amber light of the hearth. "This stew, Martha," I said, my voice sounding rough and unrefined in the quiet room. She did not look up, but the rhythm of her stirring slowed by a fraction of a second. "It is better than anything served at the Grand Hotel in town." I continued. I shook my head in genuine wonder, my heart swelling with a quiet, domestic pride. I meant it as a small offering of gratitude for the decade we had spent building this life. I wanted her to smile, to see that fleeting light in her eyes that appeared when I praised her. Then, the question escaped my lips before I could weigh the consequences of asking it. "Who taught you to cook like that?" The wooden paddle hit the side of the iron pot with a dull, echoing thud. Martha froze. The steam continued to rise in thick, white plumes, but the warmth drained from her face instantly. She did not turn around to face me. Her knuckles turned a ghostly white against the dark, stained wood of the paddle. The silence that followed was not the peaceful, comfortable kind we usually shared. It was heavy. A wall of cold stone suddenly dropped between the table and the stove. I saw her swallow hard, her throat working against a secret that evidently tasted like ash. Her eyes, usually soft like the river at dusk, turned inward to a place where I was not invited. There was a sharp, jagged pain in that look, visible even from her profile. It was the expression of a woman stepping back onto a battlefield she thought she had buried. "The soap needs more time," she whispered. Her voice was thin and brittle, like the first layer of ice on a winter pond. She did not answer my question. She did not even acknowledge that the words had been spoken. She simply went back to stirring, but the grace was gone. It was replaced by a desperate, mechanical effort that looked like a struggle for survival. I looked down at my bowl, the steam from the stew still hitting my face with false warmth. The flavor had changed in my mind. Seasoned now with the metallic tang of fear, I realized then that I had accidentally stumbled upon a ghost. For 10 years, I had loved the woman who stood before me. I knew the way she liked her tea steeped until it was dark and strong. I knew the way she hummed a specific, mournful tune when she mended my wool coats. Yet, in that single moment of silence, I realized I was married to a stranger. She was a woman who carried the refinement of a palace in the hands of a common peasant. The spoon felt heavy in my hand, like a lead weight pulling me down into an abyss of doubt. I wanted to apologize, to take the words back and let them dissolve in the freezing air. But the damage was done. The question had pried open a door locked with a key I did not possess. The pain radiating from her back was palpable, a physical force pushing me away. I did not push her for an answer because the hurt in her eyes was a debt I was not ready to collect. Martha resumed her work, her back a rigid, unyielding line against the world. I finished my meal in the deepening shadows, wondering how many secrets were hidden in the steam. The fire in the stove flickered, casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to mock my ignorance. Every shadow told a piece of a story she was not ready to share. I reached out to touch her shoulder as I walked past her toward the back door. She flinched. It was only for a second, a tiny hitch in her breath, but it was enough. It told me that the wound I had touched was still raw, still bleeding after all these years. I went to the window and looked out at the white, howling void of the Pennsylvania night. Somewhere out there, in the wind and the dark, her past was waiting for the spring thaw, and for the first time in a decade. I was terrified of what would happen when the snow melted. Our quiet life was built on a foundation of silences. I watched her from the doorway, her silhouette framed by the glowing embers. She looked so small against the vastness of the secrets she carried. I wanted to protect her from whatever memory had just turned her to stone. But I knew I could not fight a ghost I could not see. The smell of lavender from the soap began to fill the room, clashing with the savory French stew. It was a house of two worlds. I was standing on the border, wondering if I would ever be allowed to cross. The river had a hunger that year. It was the spring of 1878, long before the iron frost of this current winter settled in. The Susquehanna had broken its banks, turning from a neighbor into a churning, mud-colored beast. I remembered the roar of the water, a sound like 1,000 freight trains derailed. It was the year of the Great Flood, a disaster that swept away entire villages and dreams alike. I had seen a piano floating down the river, its ivory keys gleaming like teeth in the sun. I had seen a cradle, empty and spinning in the eddies, a sight that broke my heart. I saw the calluses grow on her hands over the years, replacing the softness of a lady. I saw her trade her silks for wool and her piano for a washboard. She sacrificed an identity of wealth for a life of grueling, honest labor. There is a profound courage in choosing to be nobody when you were once everything. Justice in the frontier is not found in courtrooms, it is found in the loyalty of a partner. She had given me her life, her youth, and her labor. In return, I had promised her a sanctuary of silence, but tonight, the silence had failed us. The 1880s were a time of great upheaval, of industrial titans and starving workers. The Gilded Age glittered in the cities, built on the backs of people like us. I wondered if she had been a part of that glitter, a jewel lost in the Susquehanna's greed. True dignity is not found in a title or a bank account. It is found in the way a woman holds her head high while making soap from fat and ashes. She had chosen this life, this man, and this hardship. She had traded a life of leisure for a life of love, and that sacrifice was a debt I could never repay. I watched her stir the pot, her movements returning to a semblance of their former rhythm. She was a survivor of a storm much greater than the blizzard outside. Her past was a country I had never visited, a land of red wine and refined tastes. But her present was here, with me, in the cold and the dark and the mud. I wanted to cross the room and tell her that none of it mattered, but the rigid line of her shoulders stopped me. Whatever answer lay behind her silence was not ready to be spoken, and for the moment, loving her meant allowing the question to remain unanswered. The sound of it remains the sharpest blade in my memory. It was a low, constant roar that vibrated through the soles of my heavy leather boots. The Great Flood had finally receded, leaving behind a scarred landscape that looked like the end of the world. Pennsylvania had seen many rages, but the waters of 1878 felt like a divine judgment on the valley. The Susquehanna had transformed from a lifeline into a graveyard of shattered pines and thick, suffocating river silt. I walked through the low pastures, my eyes searching for any livestock the torrent might have spared. The air was thick, smelling of wet earth, rot, and the metallic tang of broken things. That was the moment I saw her. She was tangled in a treacherous nest of driftwood and gray river mud, nearly invisible against the debris. At first, my mind refused to see a person. I thought she was just another fallen birch tree, stripped of its white bark by the rocks. Then, a pale hand twitched against a log. She was lying face down, her dress shredded into gray ribbons that clung to her like weeping skin. I didn't think. I simply plunged into the freezing muck, the weight of the mud pulling at my legs. When I reached her and rolled her over, I expected to see a local girl from one of the farms upstream, perhaps a daughter of the millers or a farmhand's wife. Instead, I looked down at a face that belonged in a velvet-lined locket, not in the dirt of a frontier valley. Even coated in gray silt, her features possessed a sharp, delicate clarity that took my breath away. Her skin was the color of a winter moon, translucent and terrifyingly cold. She was barely breathing. Her chest moved in shallow, ragged hitches that rattled with the weight of the river. She had no trunk, no satchel, and no shoes to protect her from the jagged stones. But her right hand was clenched into a white-knuckled fist, frozen shut by the cold. I had to pry her fingers open one by one, expecting to find a locket or perhaps a stolen gold coin. A single silver spoon fell into the mud. It hit the silt with a dull thud, feeling heavy, far heavier than the cheap tinware we used at the farm. The handle was etched with a delicate pattern of vines and a crest that looked like a blooming lily. It was a piece of another world, polished by generations of use but still radiating a quiet, cold wealth. I wiped the mud from the bowl of the spoon and felt a shiver that had nothing to do with the damp wind. This was a relic of a life that had been dismantled by the same water that now tried to claim her. I carried her home across my broad shoulders, her weight lighter than a single bale of hay. She felt like a bird with broken wings, fragile enough to shatter if I stepped too heavily. The fever came for her during that first night in the cabin. It was a dry, consuming fire that tried to finish the work the river had started. I moved my bed to the hard kitchen floor, keeping the hearth roaring until the very walls began to sweat. I bathed her forehead with cool well water, watching the steam rise from her skin. I forced thin broth between her cracked lips, praying for a swallow that didn't come. She didn't speak in her delirium. She only wept in a language that sounded like soft, rhythmic music. It wasn't the harsh German of the valley or the rough, practical English of our town. It was something fluid and old, full of vowels that seemed to hurt her throat as they escaped. It was the sound of a woman mourning a kingdom that no longer existed. On the third night, the fever finally broke like a summer storm. She opened her eyes and looked at me, and for a moment, I felt like a trespasser in my own house. There was no fear in her gaze, only a profound, devastating exhaustion that reached back centuries. She saw the silver spoon sitting on the nightstand, gleaming under the flickering tallow candle. Her hand flew to it, clutching the metal to her chest like it was a holy relic or a piece of a lost soul. "Safe," she whispered. That was the first word she ever gave me, a tiny anchor thrown into the dark. As the weeks passed and she recovered, the mystery of Martha began to grow like weeds in an untended garden. She took over the chores as soon as she could stand, her pride refusing to let her be a burden. I watched her move across the porch, her back as straight as a soldier's on parade. She carried herself with a natural grace that made my rough-hewn house look like a timber shack. She possessed a dignity that wasn't earned through titles, but through the sheer will to remain upright. Yet, when I looked at her hands, the story she told with her eyes began to fracture. They weren't the soft, pampered hands of a lady of leisure who spent her days at embroidery. They were calloused at the palms and scarred along the knuckles with old, faded marks. These were hands that had scrubbed floors, handled heavy iron pots, and worked until the skin bled. She was a contradiction I couldn't solve, a puzzle of silk and iron. She had the eyes of a queen and the hands of a servant who had known the back of a master's hand. Word of the river woman spread through the valley faster than the spring thaw. The first visitors came on a Thursday afternoon. Mrs. Gable arrived with Mrs. Whitmore from the general store and a widow named Ruth Harlan, who seemed to attend every funeral, wedding, and private misfortune within 20 miles. They carried a loaf of bread, a jar of preserved peaches, and enough curiosity to fill a church. I saw them from the barn and hurried toward the house. Martha had already opened the door. She stood in her plain brown dress with her hands folded in front of her. Her hair was pinned neatly, though the wind had pulled 2 dark strands loose beside her face. "We heard you were feeling stronger," Mrs. Gable said. Her smile was broad and empty. Martha stepped aside. "Please come in." The three women entered as if inspecting a property before an auction. Mrs. Whitmore looked at the cabinets. Ruth examined the silver spoon resting beside the wash basin. Mrs. Gable looked directly at Martha's hands. "You speak very well," she said. "For a woman found in the river." Martha placed cups on the table. "I spoke before the river found me." Mrs. Whitmore laughed too loudly. Ruth did not laugh at all. "Arthur says you remember nothing," Ruth asked. "I do not believe Arthur said that," and the widow's mouth tightened. Martha poured hot water over dried mint leaves. She did it slowly, without spilling a drop. Mrs. Gable watched every movement. "Were you a housemaid in Philadelphia?" "No." "A cook?" Martha's hand paused above the third cup. "No." Mrs. Whitmore leaned closer. "Can you read?" Martha looked at her. "Yes." "English?" "Enough." "French?" The question struck something. I saw it in the quick movement of Martha's eyes toward the silver spoon. But her voice remained calm. "I can read what is necessary." Mrs. Gable accepted the cup Martha offered. She took one sip and raised her eyebrows. "You have a delicate hand with tea." Martha sat across from them. "I use the same leaves you use." "That is not what I meant." The room grew quiet. I stood near the door, angry enough to send all three women back into the road. But Martha glanced at me once. The look said clearly that she did not need rescuing. Mrs. Whitmore turned toward the cabinets. "Those are expensive pieces." "They survived the flood," Martha said. "Convenient." My hand closed around the doorframe. Before I could speak, Martha answered. "Survival often looks convenient to those who were not required to do it." Ruth Harlan set down her cup. Her face had changed. For the first time, she seemed ashamed. Miss Gable, however, continued, "People are only trying to understand who has come among us." Martha folded her hands in her lap. "No, Mrs. Gable. People are trying to decide whether the story they invented is more satisfying than the truth. And what is the truth?" Martha looked toward me. For one long moment, I thought she might finally reveal everything. Instead, she said, "The truth is that your neighbor pulled me from the river. The truth is that I work for the food I eat. The truth is that I have harmed no one in this valley. Anything beyond that is not owed to you." Nobody spoke. The wind moved softly through the chimney. Mrs. Whitmore looked down at her tea. Ruth reached for a slice of bread. Mrs. Gable rose. Her cheeks were red. "We should be going." Martha stood with them. At the door, Ruth paused. She took Martha's hand. "My husband died in the mill collapse," she said quietly. "For 3 years, people asked me how it happened as if grief were a public performance." Martha's expression softened. "I am sorry," Ruth nodded. "So am I." After the wagon carried the women down the road, I found Martha washing the cups. She scrubbed one of them far longer than necessary. "Why did you let them stay?" I asked. "Because turning them away would have fed them a better story." "You did not have to be polite." She set the cup upside down on a cloth. "Politeness is not surrender." I leaned against the table. "You could have defended yourself." Martha looked at me then. Her face was tired, but there was no defeat in it. People who have already decided who you are do not listen to a defense. They only collect pieces of it to sharpen their judgment. I wanted to tell her that the town would learn to respect her, but I did not know if that was true. So I told her the truth I did know. They can think what they please. This is your home. Her eyes moved around the small kitchen. The rough walls, the scarred table, the repaired cabinets. Finally, she looked at me. Then perhaps that is enough. A week later, Ruth Harlan returned alone. She brought no questions. Only a basket of apples and a torn black dress. She did not know how to mend. Martha repaired it without asking for payment. By winter, Ruth no longer called her the river woman. She called her Martha. Crestfall remained a suspicious town, and rumors about Martha lingered for months. But Ruth's friendship was the first sign that not every heart in the valley was closed to her. I ignored them all, finding a strange peace in the silence she brought to my hearth. I watched her learn the rhythm of the farm with a desperate, silent intensity. She didn't just do the work, she mastered it with a ferocity that bordered on penance. She watched the way I milked the cows, her eyes memorizing every movement. At first, I believed she was simply trying to repay me. She rose before dawn, carried water, swept the ashes, and insisted on learning every task that kept the farm alive, but repayment has a limit. Martha worked as if she were trying to earn permission to remain in the world. One morning, I found her standing beside my mare with a bridle held upside down. The mare, Daisy, watched her with the patient disappointment of an old school teacher. "You intend to ride her?" I asked. Martha glanced at the saddle. "I intend to learn. Today, unless the horse has another appointment." It was the first joke I had heard from her. I tried not to smile. Daisy was gentle, but she disliked uncertainty. I showed Martha how to approach from the left, how to let the mare smell her hand, and how to slide the bit without striking the animal's teeth. Martha listened once. The second time, she did it without help. When I cupped my hands to lift her into the saddle, she hesitated. Not from fear, from pride. "You cannot climb in that dress without help," I said. "I have survived worse indignities." She placed one boot in my hands while I lifted. She settled into the saddle with such natural balance that I stepped back in surprise. "Have you done this before?" Her fingers tightened around the reins. No, it was a lie, not a cruel one, a frightened one. I pretended to believe it. For several mornings, we rode only inside the paddock. I taught her to turn Daisy with pressure from the reins. I taught her to use her knees and to sit deep when the mare changed pace. Martha learned too quickly. On the fifth morning, a rabbit burst from the grass. Daisy startled and broke into a run. I shouted for Martha to pull back. Instead, she lowered her body, gave the mare her head for 3 strides, then guided her in a wide circle until the animal slowed. No beginner could have done it. Martha rode back with color in her cheeks and wind in her hair. She looked alive in a way I had never seen. "Who taught you?" I asked. The happiness vanished. She dismounted and handed me the reins. "No one who matters now." That evening, I found her in the barn brushing Daisy. The mare's eyes were half closed. Martha spoke to her in French. I did not understand the words, but I recognized the tone. It was the voice one uses with a frightened child. I leaned against the stall. "She likes you. She understands what it is to be handled by strangers." I did not ask what she meant. Instead, I picked up a second brush and worked on the mare's other side. For a while, the only sound was the scrape of bristles over hide. Martha finally said, "There were horses where I lived." I waited. My mother did not approve of me riding. Why? She said kitchens were dangerous enough. A small smile touched her mouth. "But my brother taught me before he died." The last words were almost lost beneath Daisy's breathing. I stopped brushing. "I am sorry." "So am I." It was the first piece of her past she had given willingly. Small, sharp, precious. I did not reach for more. The following spring, Martha rode with me to check the north fence. The river had softened the ground and one of the posts had fallen. While I dug a new hole, she held the post steady. Mud soaked the hem of her dress. A strand of hair stuck to her cheek. She looked nothing like the silent woman I had carried from the flood. She looked like someone building a life. When the post was secure, she sat on the grass and opened the cloth bundle she had brought. Inside were 2 pieces of bread, cold beef, and a small apple tart. "You made this before sunrise." I could not allow a fence to be repaired on an empty stomach. I sat beside her. The tart was delicate, the crust layered and crisp despite the rough journey in her saddlebag. I took one bite and closed my eyes. "You have been hiding this talent. I have been feeding you for 6 months. Not like this." She looked toward the river. Her expression tightened. Could have asked the question then, "Who taught you?" Where did this come from? Instead, I broke the tart in half and handed her the larger piece. Her eyebrows rose. "You worked harder," I said. Martha accepted it. We ate in silence. But this silence was different. It did not keep us apart. It gave us room to stay. On the ride home, Daisy and my gelding walked side by side. Martha's knee brushed mine once. Neither of us moved away. That evening, she placed the repaired bridle on its peg, I realized she was no longer working to repay a debt, and I was no longer waiting for her to leave. Without a ceremony, without witnesses, without either of us daring to name it, the farm had become ours. The next morning, she was already in the barn before the sun had even kissed the horizon. She learned to pluck a chicken and dry herbs as if her life depended on the absolute precision of the task. She sought perfection in the mundane, as if hard labor was the only thing keeping her ghost at bay. But she never talked about where those skills came from or who had taught her to survive. Every time I mentioned the river or the cities to the east, she would go perfectly still. It was the same stillness I saw in the kitchen just now, 10 years later. Whenever the past knocked, a shudder would draw across her eyes, and she would simply find a reason to leave the room. She was a master of the graceful exit, leaving behind nothing but the scent of lavender and lye. The silver spoon stayed in her apron pocket for months, a hidden weight against her thigh. I would see her thumbing the crest on the handle when she thought I was busy with the plow. It was her anchor, her only connection to a shore she had been forced to leave behind. I remember one evening clearly, the sun setting in violent shades of orange and gold over the Susquehanna. She was standing by the fence, looking toward the water that had nearly taken her life. The wind caught her hair, pulling it back from her face and revealing the sharp line of her jaw. She looked like a statue of a woman watching for a ship that had sunk long ago. I walked up beside her, wanting to say something that would finally bridge the silence between us. I wanted to tell her that her past didn't matter to me, that her calloused hands were beautiful. "The river is quiet tonight," I said softly, my voice barely a murmur. She didn't turn her head, but I saw her knuckles whiten as she gripped the rough fence rail. "The river never forgets what it takes, Arthur," she said, her voice heavy with a sorrow that felt centuries old. "And it never gives back what it breaks." She looked at me then, and I saw the truth of her sacrifice in the depths of her tired eyes. She wasn't just a survivor, she was a woman who had traded everything for the right to breathe. She had walked through fire and water to find a place where she could simply exist without apology. I realized then that I hadn't just saved a woman from the flood on that terrible morning. I had pulled a ghost out of the mud, and she was still haunting the ruins of her own heart. I didn't care about the gossips in town or the mystery of her aristocratic features. I only knew that the house felt warmer, more like a home, with her inside its walls. The silence she brought with her wasn't an empty void. It was a sanctuary of quiet, resilient strength. We didn't need a shared past to build a present, or so I convinced myself back then. I watched her reach into her pocket and touch the spoon, her fingers tracing the lily crest. She was a woman of high birth who had learned the dignity of the dirt. She had lost her world, but she had found her soul in the labor of her scarred hands. Love isn't always a grand declaration made in a sunlit garden. Sometimes, love is the silence two people share while they wait for the world to stop shaking. It is the act of holding a candle in the dark. Even when you don't know who is walking towards you, she was my mystery, my labor, and my quiet, unspoken grace. And as the sun dipped below the trees, I knew I would spend the rest of my life protecting her, even if she never told me the name of the girl she used to be before the water rose. Even if the silver spoon was the only piece of her heart she ever allowed me to see. True courage is the ability to lose everything and still choose to plant a garden in the ruins. And Martha was the most courageous woman I had ever known. The river had taken her name, but I would give her a future. We stood there in the fading light, two survivors of different storms, anchored by a piece of silver. The water flowed on, indifferent to our struggles, but we remained so. And that was enough for a man who had spent his life waiting for a miracle in the mud. I reached out and touched her hand, the one that didn't hold the spoon. She didn't pull away, and in that small gesture, the bridge was finally built. We were no longer a rescuer and a victim. We were two souls deciding that the past was a weight we no longer had to carry alone. The silver spoon would eventually find its way to a drawer, but its story would remain etched in our bones. It was the price of admission to a new life, a life where dignity was found in the work and love was found in the survival. As we walked back to the cabin, the first stars began to pierce the darkening sky. They were cold and distant, but they were constant. Just like the woman walking beside me, whose silence was the most beautiful song I had ever heard. The river roared in the distance, but inside our hearts, the storm had finally passed. We were home, and for the first time, home was more than just a roof and four walls. It was a promise kept in the face of a world that tried to wash us away. The year is 1888. The wind outside is no longer a sound. It is a physical weight, a white leviathan pressing against the timber walls of our farmhouse. The great white hurricane has descended upon Pennsylvania with a fury that feels biblical. For 3 days, the world has ceased to exist beyond the frost-etched glass of our windows. The sky is a bruised charcoal. The fields are buried under 20 feet of shifting, suffocating powder. I sit in the heavy oak chair, watching the shadows dance across the floorboards. Time was supposed to be a river that washed away the silt of our beginnings. I believed that if I poured enough love into the hollow spaces of her heart, the ghosts would eventually tire of screaming. But as the shutters rattle like bone against bone, I realize my error. The past is not a place we leave behind on a map. It is a stowaway. It hides in the heavy lining of a winter coat. It lingers in the bitter aftertaste of a well-seasoned stew. I glance at the empty bowl sitting on the scarred pine table. Even now, I can feel the phantom weight of that silver spoon resting in the air between us. The woman I dragged from the mud of the Susquehanna is still there. She is seated across from me, separated by a wall of silence more impenetrable than the snowdrifts outside. The river is still roaring, muffled but persistent, just beneath the floorboards of our shared life. I hear her moving in the kitchen. Her footsteps are light, rhythmic, and terrifyingly precise. After a decade of marriage, she still walks as if she is afraid to leave a footprint on the earth. She moves like a woman who expects the ground to give way at any second. I want to stand up. I want to cross the small gap between us and hold her until the secrets finally spill out of her like blood from a wound. But I remember the look in her eyes from this morning. I had asked the one question that is forbidden in this house. It was a simple inquiry about a name, a place, a fragment of a life before the flood. The light didn't just fade from her eyes, it died. It wasn't just the shadow of old pain. It was a raw, desperate plea for mercy. She is a veteran of a war I have no map for. The river gave her to me, but it kept the deed to her soul. I wonder if the truth is like these floodwaters. Perhaps it is safer to keep it buried under the silt and the debris of the years. When the dam finally breaks, there is no choosing what remains. The rush of the truth might sweep away the very foundation of the home we have built. I close my eyes. I see her as she was on that first day, pale, shattered, clutching a piece of silver as if it were the only solid thing in a liquid world. We are all clinging to something to keep from sinking. I am clinging to the hope that she is more than the sum of her tragedies. The fire in the hearth pops, a sharp, violent crack in the suffocating quiet. I stand up, my joints protesting the damp cold of the 1888 winter. Outside, the snow continues its relentless work. It is a beautiful, white shroud, but I know what is underneath. The mud is still there, waiting for the spring thaw to turn the world back into a swamp. Martha is waiting, too. She is waiting for the past to finally catch her. Or perhaps she is waiting for the silence to become loud enough to break us both. Martha does not speak with words. She speaks with the labor of her hands. I watch her sit by the hearth as the storm tries to tear the roof from our heads. A quilt lies across her lap. It is a map of a country I have never been allowed to visit. She draws the needle through the heavy batting with a precision that seems almost supernatural in the dim lamplight. The sound is a rhythmic hiss and click. It is the only heartbeat left in this frozen room. I look at the scraps of fabric she has chosen to bind together. There is a square of coarse blue denim, taken from the pants I wore when we cleared the north pasture. Beside it sits a strip of floral calico, a remnant of a summer dress she wore until the hem turned to rags. Then, my eyes catch a piece that does not belong in this valley. It is a sliver of silk. The color is a deep, bruised plum. It is fine, delicate, and entirely alien to a Pennsylvania farmhouse. We do not sell such things in Crestfall. Martha has never asked for anything more than salt, flour, or seed at the general store. Yet, here it is. stitched perfectly into the fabric of our everyday lives. I want to ask her where a farm wife found silk the color of a sunset. I want to know what dress it was cut from. I want to know whose skin it once brushed against in a ballroom far away from the mud. But I remember the silence. I remember the way her hands trembled when I mentioned the silver spoon. So, I hold my peace. I watch her thumb press the seam flat. Her movements are surgical, devoid of the clumsy haste of other women in the valley. Most people here sew to keep the cold out. Martha sews to keep the pieces of her own soul from drifting apart. She handles these scraps as if they are fragile, living memories. If she pulls the thread too tight, the memory might shatter. If she leaves it too loose, the truth might slip through the gaps. I realize this quilt is not a blanket. It is a ledger. It is a record of everything she has lost and everything she has managed to reclaim from the wreckage of the river. A few days ago, I watched her make the winter soap. It is a brutal, stinging task that most women dread. The smell of rendering fat usually hangs heavy and sour in the air for a week. The lye is a dangerous, hungry chemical. It burns the lungs and turns the skin a raw, angry red. I offered to help her with the heavy iron vat. She declined with a small, sharp shake of her head that brooked no argument. I watched her through the frosted window of the woodshed. She moved through the rising steam like a phantom in a dream. She didn't dump the ingredients with the haphazard weariness of a tired farm wife. She measured the ash with a steady, practiced hand. She skimmed the tallow until it was as white and pure as the falling snow outside. Then, she brought out the oil, lavender. She had spent the entire summer drying the purple buds behind the shed. She had pressed them under heavy fieldstones until they surrendered their essence. As the soap cooled, the scent began to drift across the frozen yard. It didn't smell like a farm in winter. It smelled like a garden in a place where the sun never sets. It smelled like the ghost of a lady. When she finally brought the bars into the house, they were wrapped in clean, white linen. She set them on the pantry shelf in rows of perfect, military precision. They were not just blocks of lye and fat. They were small, fragrant shields against the grime of our daily labor. I picked one up when she was busy at the stove. It was smooth, almost like polished marble from a cathedral. No woman I know has the patience to make something this beautiful just to wash a man's work clothes. No woman I know treats a chore like a sacred ceremony. It makes me wonder about the hands that taught her these things. Were they hands that once held lace fans in high-ceilinged parlors? Were they hands that commanded a dozen servants in a kitchen larger than my entire barn? Every time she displays a new skill, the mystery of her past grows a new, thorny branch. Yesterday, I found her repairing my heavy wool winter coat. The lining had been torn for 3 years. I had expected a rough patch of wool and a thick, ugly stitch. Instead, I found a hidden masterpiece tucked inside the sleeve. She had used a cross-stitch I had only ever seen in the fine margins of old Bibles. The thread was reinforced for strength. The seam was invisible from the outside. But near the collar, she had embroidered a tiny, secret mark. A small bird in flight. It was done in white thread, nearly invisible against the gray wool. It was a gift intended only for the man who wore the coat. A lump formed in my throat as I traced the tiny, stitched wings with my calloused thumb. She gives me everything she has. She gives me the warmth of the fire, the cleanliness of the linens, and the beauty of her silent labor. She gives me a home built on the ruins of a life she will not name. Is that not the truest form of courage, to lose everything to the water and then decide to build something new on the mud? To carry the weight of 100 secrets and never let them crush the spirit of the person you love. Justice is a word men use in courtrooms, but dignity is what a woman keeps when the world has tried to strip her bare. Martha has more dignity in her silent thumb than I have in my entire body. The blizzard of 1888 will eventually break, the snow will melt, and the Susquehanna will rise again. But inside these walls, we have a different kind of strength. It is the strength of the hidden stitch. It is the power of the lavender soap. It is the love that does not need to ask questions because it already knows the answer. The answer is survival. The answer is the choice to stay. I walk over to the hearth and place a hand on her shoulder. She doesn't flinch. She doesn't look up from her quilting, but she leans her head, just for a second, against my arm, in the cold, dark heart of the great hurricane. That small movement is enough. It is the only truth I need. The past can keep its names and its ballrooms. The river can keep its secrets. I have the woman, the quilt, and the bird hidden in my collar. We are home. And for the first time, I understand that home is not a place where you are known. It is a place where you are accepted, even in the shadows. The wind howls, but the fire holds. We are the survivors of the flood and the frost. We are the beauty that remains after the storm has taken everything else. I sit back down and watch her needle rise and fall, hiss and click, the heartbeat of our life, the music of a woman who chose to live. The lavender scent clung to the quilt like a prayer. It was a soft, floral ghost in our small cabin. It competed with the sharp, metallic tang of the coming frost. Martha did not speak. She rarely did when the needle was in her hand. Her silence was a physical thing. It was a fortress. It was a sanctuary. I watched her from the shadows of my chair. I saw the way her eyes lingered on the silver spoon. It was a heavy, ornate thing. It looked out of place on our rough-hewn shelf. It belonged to a world of silk and candlelit ballrooms, a world that had chewed her up and spat her into the mud. The spoon was her only witness. It was the North Star of her secret history. She reached for the final scrap of cloth. It was white linen. It was fine, expensive fabric, but in the center sat a rust-colored stain, a smudge of old blood that refused to fade. She didn't try to hide it. She didn't try to patch over it. She placed it directly in the heart of her masterpiece. I felt a lump form in my throat. That stain was her truth. It was the mark of a woman who had bled but did not break. The room grew colder as the fire ebbed. The wind outside began to change its tune. It was no longer a whistle. It was a low, rhythmic thrumming. The house creaked under the weight of the atmosphere. The pressure was dropping. I knew that feeling. Every farmer in the valley knew it. The great white hurricane was no longer a threat. It was a reality. It was March 12, 1888, the day the sky decided to bury the world. Martha's needle moved with frantic grace. She pulled the final thread through the quilt and tied it with her teeth. Then she rose so quickly that the chair scraped across the floor. I thought she was going to block the door. Instead, she crossed to the pantry and reached behind the flour crock. From the narrow space between the shelf and the wall, she removed a small linen pouch. It was faded, nearly white with age. A single purple thread had been stitched around its edge. "What is that?" I asked. She did not answer. She opened the pouch and placed several dried lavender buds inside. Then she added rosemary was, a pinch of salt, and a narrow strip of plum-colored silk, the same silk I had seen in the quilt. Her hands moved quickly, but they were trembling. "Martha, my mother carried one during the siege." She folded the pouch and tied it shut. It was not magic. I did not think it was. She said a person should carry something that reminds him where he belongs. She stepped close and pushed the pouch into the inside pocket of my coat. Her fingers remained over my heart. The gesture was so intimate that I forgot the cattle for one brief second. "You have never spoken of her," I said. Martha's eyes dropped. "I speak of her every time I cook." The wind struck the house hard enough to make the stovepipe groan. A burst of snow forced its way beneath the door. I looked toward the window. The north paddock had disappeared behind a wall of white. "I have to go." Martha caught my sleeve. "You do not have to save everything. If the cattle die, we may lose the farm. If you die, I lose more than the farm." Her voice did not rise. That made the fear inside it worse. I touched her cheek. "I will follow the guide rope to the barn. The rope does not reach the north paddock. I know the way. No one knows a way through that." She pointed toward the window. There was no field, no fence, no sky, only white. I had never seen Martha argue with me so directly. For 10 years, she had accepted every hardship without complaint. Now she stood between me and the door like a woman ready to fight the storm herself. "I cannot sit here and listen to them die, I said, "and I cannot sit here and wait for you to die." The words struck us both. Martha turned away. She pressed one hand against the table. For a moment, her shoulders shook. When she faced me again, the fear had been hidden behind the calm expression she wore during every crisis. Then promise me something. Anything. If you lose the rope, turn back. If you cannot feel your hands, turn back. If you begin to feel warm, Arthur, that means the cold is winning. I nodded. She gripped my coat. Say it. I will turn back. Before the cattle. Before the cattle. She searched my face, deciding whether I was lying. Then she went to the stove. She poured hot broth into a small covered tin and wrapped it in wool. She placed it inside my coat on the opposite side from the linen pouch. The tin may freeze. Then I will bring it back untouched. Her mouth trembled. That is not amusing. No. I took her hand. No, it is not. The room seemed suddenly too small for all the words we had avoided during our marriage. I wanted to tell her that I loved her. I had shown it 1,000 times in wood chopped, roofs repaired, and fields planted, but spoken love felt different. It felt dangerous. Like opening the iron box before I knew what waited inside. Martha understood anyway. She always understood what I could not say. She stepped forward and rested her forehead against my chest. The pouch of lavender lay between us. I was not afraid of the river, she whispered. I had already lost everything. But I am afraid now. Why? Because now I have something the storm can take. My arms closed around her. The house shook. The wind screamed around the corners. For the first time, I understood that her silence had never meant emptiness. It had been the sound of someone protecting the last fragile thing she possessed. I will come back, I said. Do not promise what the storm controls. Then I promise what I control. She lifted her face. What is that? Every step I take will be toward this house. Martha closed her eyes. Then she reached up and adjusted my collar over the embroidered bird. Her thumb pressed the hidden stitches flat. Go, she said, but remember what is in your pocket. I touched the pouch. Your mother. Your home. I opened the door. The storm struck with the force of an animal. Before the white swallowed me, I looked back once. Martha stood beside the fire, one hand pressed against her heart. Then the door closed between us. I stepped out the door. The world vanished instantly. The wind hit me like a physical blow from a giant's fist. It stole the breath from my lungs. It turned my vision into a blur of stinging white needles. The temperature had plummeted 20 degrees in minutes. The telegraph lines were already snapping across Pennsylvania. Entire towns disappeared behind walls of white. No one could see more than a few yards ahead. The trains were freezing to the tracks in New York, and here I was, a lone man in a white sea. I reached for the guide rope I had strung to the barn. My mittens were already stiffening. The cold didn't just chill me. It searched for my soul. It was a predatory, intelligent cold. I found the barn door by the sound of the wood screaming. I didn't stop. I pushed toward the north paddock. Every step was a battle of wills. The snow was already at my knees. It was fine as flour and heavy as lead. I thought of Martha by the hearth. I thought of that silver spoon. She had lost everything once. Her family, her name, her dignity. I would not let her lose this home. I found the first steer. It was a ghost in the drift. Its eyes were iced shut. Its breath was a frozen mask around its muzzle. I shouted, but the wind ate my voice. I grabbed its halter and pulled. We moved like snails through a river of diamonds. The second steer followed, driven by primal fear. The wind shifted. A gust of 70 miles per hour hit us head on. I lost my footing. I slid into a depression I didn't know was there. The snow swirled over me. It was a soft, white blanket. My muscles began to relax. The pain in my fingers faded into a dull, pleasant hum. This was the danger. The seductive sleep of the frostbite. The mind begins to wander when the blood slows down. I saw my mother's garden. I saw the sun on the water of my youth. Then, I felt the bird, the tiny, embroidered stitches under my collar. They were rough against my neck. They were a needle prick of reality. Martha's work. Martha's love. She had spent 1,000 hours on that quilt. She had stitched her life into the fabric of mine. If I stayed here, I was throwing her gift away. I was leaving her to the silence. I was leaving her to the ghosts of the river. A man is not measured by the battles he wins. He is measured by the things he refuses to abandon. I am a man of the soil. I am a man of the hearth. I am the man who loves a woman with a stained linen past. That love is my dignity. That love is my only law. I forced my hand to move. I dug into the drift. I screamed at the sky. It was a raw, animal sound of defiance. I would not die in a ditch. Not today. Not while there was lavender scent in my house. I grabbed the lead rope of the steer. I hauled myself up, inch by agonizing inch. The cattle leaned into me. We were a single organism of survival. The walk back was a blur of agony. My lungs felt like they were filled with broken glass. My heart was a drum beating against a hollow chest. Not yet, I hissed into the howling gale. The words froze before they could leave my cracked lips. I clawed at the packed snow, my fingernails torn and bleeding. The white grave tried to hold me. I dragged my deadened body out of the drift. Every inch felt like a mile. I didn't have a compass. I didn't have a lantern to guide me through the Pennsylvania void. The stars were drowned in a sea of swirling ice. I only had the memory of a woman. She had taught herself how to stay when everyone else ran. She was my North Star. I stood up, my legs trembling like a newborn calf's. The wind tried to knock me back down into the dark. It felt personal. It felt like the hand of God pressing against my chest. I leaned into the fury. I walked toward where I hoped the heart of the house was. Each step was a prayer of muscle and bone. Each breath was a defiance of the winter of 1888. The blizzard roared louder, trying to drown out my heartbeat, but I kept moving through the blinding wall of ice. Martha was on the other side of the white. She was the only thing that made the world worth the cold. She was the only reason my blood hadn't turned to slush. The wind did not just blow, it hunted. It searched for the gaps in my wool. It searched for the cracks in my spirit. What happened inside the house while I fought my way home was something Martha told me only later. Inside the kitchen, the air had turned into a thin, brittle veil of frost. Martha stood by the hearth, her shadow stretching long and jagged. The frost-covered walls looked like the inside of a tomb. The wood box was empty. The last log of hickory was nothing but a pile of glowing orange ribs. The heat was escaping through the chinks in the logs. She looked at the door. The wood groaned under the weight of the snow. Arthur was out there. The man who had given her a name was disappearing. She was a ghost when he found her. Now he was becoming a ghost in the gale. She didn't cry. Tears would only freeze on her cheeks. Fear was a luxury she had traded away. She had survived the crossing from France. She had survived the fever that took the rest of the refugees. She turned her gaze to the corner of the room. There stood the two cabinets. They were made of dark, polished cherry wood. The carvings were delicate vines from another life. They belonged in a manor in Lyon. They did not belong in a starving farmhouse in the Susquehanna Valley. They were the only things she had reclaimed from the wreckage. They held the scent of her mother's lavender. They held the echo of a world that valued beauty over survival. They represented her dignity. They were her last proof that she was once a lady. She touched the smooth, cold surface of the cherry wood. The carvings felt like braille. They told a story of a woman she no longer recognized. The wood was the color of dried blood. She picked up the heavy iron hatchet from the hearth. The steel was cold enough to stick to her skin. The first blow was the hardest. The blade bit into the cherry wood with a sickening scream. It sounded like a bone snapping. Martha didn't flinch. She struck again. The delicate vines splintered. The history of her family fell in jagged pieces at her feet. She was not just breaking furniture, she was murdering her last link to the girl of porcelain dreams. She was choosing the man over the memory. The wood was seasoned and stubborn. It fought the blade. She fed the first splinters to the dying fire. The flames leaped up, greedy and wild. They turned a vibrant, unnatural violet. The old French varnish caught like tinder. The kitchen filled with the smell of expensive oils. It was the scent of ancient history burning. It was a sacrificial pyre for a love that hadn't yet been spoken. She sat on the floor, the hatchet resting across her knees. She watched her heritage turn into heat. The house grew warm again. It was a small pocket of defiance in the center of the storm. The price of the warmth was her identity. She was stripping herself bare for his sake. Hours bled into a single, aching pulse of time. The grandfather clock had stopped. The only rhythm was the thumping of the wind. Then, a heavy thud struck the back door. It wasn't a knock. It was the sound of a falling tree. Martha lunged for the latch. Her fingers were raw and bleeding from the wood splitting. The wind roared in like a physical beast. It brought a wall of white that nearly blinded her. Arthur fell across the threshold. He didn't move. He didn't groan. I was a statue carved from blue ice. His eyelashes were thick with frost, sealing his eyes shut. He looked like a man who had been dead for a century. Martha dragged him inside. Her muscles screamed against the dead weight. Frozen limbs are heavier than living ones. She kicked the door shut and bolted it. The silence of the house returned, but it was heavy. She didn't call his name. She knew he was too far gone to hear a human voice. She stripped the stiff, ice-crusted coat from his body. The wool snapped like glass. His skin was the color of a winter moon. It was waxy. It was silent. She dragged him toward the hearth. The last of the cherry wood cabinets was roaring in the grate. The heat was intense. It smelled of lavender and sacrifice. She reached for a small, leather satchel hidden beneath the floorboards. Inside were dried roots and a vial of dark oil. It was the knowledge of the displaced. The secrets of women who had survived wars long before this valley was mapped. She rubbed the oil into her palms until they glowed. She began to work on his chest. Her movements were rhythmic and fierce. She didn't just rub. She kneaded the life back into his stubborn muscles. She fought the cold with her own strength. "Wake up," she whispered. Her voice was a low command. "I did not burn my life for you to leave me now." She stripped off her own bodice. Her warm skin met his frozen chest. The shock of this cold nearly stopped her heart. She didn't pull away. She wrapped her arms around him. She pulled his icy frame into the cradle of her own warmth. She was the hearth. She was the sun. She poured the last of her own vitality into him. Her heart beat against his silent ribs. She felt the cold from his body seep into her marrow. It felt like she was dying with him. She pressed closer. Her breath was hot against his frozen ear. She began to talk. She whispered things she had never said in the daylight. She told him about the kitchen in France. She spoke of the copper pans that shone like gold. She told him about the smell of the sea at night. She described the silk dresses she used to wear. She used the words as a bridge. She was trying to pull his soul back across the divide. "Do you hear me, Arthur? The storm doesn't own us. The ice doesn't define us. We are more than what we lost." Minutes passed like decades. The fire flickered, casting long shadows of the destroyed furniture. Suddenly, Arthur's chest hitched. It was a small, violent movement. A ragged, rattling breath tore through his lungs. It sounded like gravel. His hand, blue and claw-like, twitched against her back. Martha didn't let go. She held him tighter. Her tears finally fell. They were hot and silent. They landed on his frozen shoulder like molten lead. The fire from the cherry wood began to fade into embers. The room stayed warm. The blizzard still raged outside, but the ice inside Arthur was melting. He opened his eyes. The pupils were dilated and unfocused. He looked at her, then at the empty corner. He saw the space where the cabinets had stood. He saw the ash in the grate. He saw the hatchet on the floor. He realized what she had done. He didn't have the strength to speak. He squeezed her hand. The grip was weak, but it was there. It was the most beautiful thing she had ever felt. It was a pact. They lay there on the floor, two people stitched together by fire and sacrifice. The past was gone. The cherry wood was smoke in the wind. Her French heritage was now just a memory in the ashes, but the heartbeat between them was new. It was loud enough to drown out the storm. Justice in this world is often cold. Dignity is something the law cannot give you. It is something you carve out for yourself with a hatchet and a prayer. It is the choice to burn your yesterday to save someone's tomorrow. True courage isn't the absence of fear or the strength of an army. It is the quiet determination to remain human when the world turns to ice. It is the willingness to be known and still be loved. Martha later told me that when she looked at me, she saw a man worth every splinter of her past. She saw a future that didn't require a silver spoon. The silence of the house felt different now. It wasn't the silence of secrets or the silence of ghosts. It was the silence of a clean slate. Martha watched the last ember of the French cabinets wink out. The lavender scent lingered in the air like a blessing. She was no longer the daughter of a chef. She was no longer the survivor of a flood. She was the woman who had held back the winter with her own 2 hands. She was the queen of a house made of ash and love. As the gray light of morning began to bleed through the frost, the world appeared. It was white and new. The snow had buried the old paths. They would have to find new ones, but they would do it together. The price was her history. The reward was his life. And in the quiet dawn of Pennsylvania, that was enough. Philly was far away, and Lyon was a dream. But this floor was real. This warmth was earned if out. They had survived the night. They were the beauty that remained, because that is what survivors do. They don't look back at the flood. They look at the next sunrise. They look at the next stitch in the quilt of their lives. Arthur pulled her closer. The ice was gone. The fire was in their blood now. And for the first time, the wind had no power over them. The storm had taken the wood, but it couldn't touch the heart. The world was reborn in the cold, and they were its only witnesses. The reward was the man breathing softly against her heart. She closed her eyes and finally slept. The fire was out. The house remained warm. Snow began to recede. It left behind a world of mud and heavy silence. The Pennsylvania sun was a pale, weak thing. It reflected off the slush clinging to the eaves. The dawn was a ghost of the night's fury. I spent the morning clearing debris from the kitchen. The floor was warped. The dampness and the heat of the sacrificial fire had bent the wood. I moved to the corner. This was where Martha had knelt during the storm. She had searched for her medicines there. One of the floorboards sat unevenly. Its edge was splintered and dark. I reached for my crowbar to set it right. The wood groaned as it came free. I did not find just dust and cobwebs. Nestled in the hollow of the foundation was a small, rusted iron box. It was heavy for its size. The lid was sealed with a bead of old wax. It was meant to keep out the damp of the earth. I sat on the floor. Cold mud seeped into my trousers. I pried the box open. Inside, wrapped in a scrap of stained silk, lay a stack of papers. There was also a small, oval portrait. The woman in the portrait had Martha's eyes. But she wore a lace collar. She had a look of quiet, regal exhaustion. The letter on top was written in a cramped, elegant hand. The ink had faded to the color of dried blood. It was written in French. The grace of the script spoke of a world far removed from the Susquehanna. I had spent enough time in the ports to recognize certain words. I saw the words for mother and daughter. My fingers brushed the paper. I felt the weight of a history I was never supposed to touch. I looked at the dates. Paris, 1870. This was the time of the great upheaval. Empires had crumbled. The hungry had taken what was left. The letter was not a confession. It was a manual for survival disguised as a blessing. My dearest Martha, it began. The English translation formed in my mind. I recognized the roots of the words. They have taken the silver and the titles, but they cannot take the fire. I taught you the sauces of the court, so you would never know the hunger of the street. In every pinch of salt, remember our name. In every turn of the spoon, hold on to the home they burned. Martha's mother had trained in Lyon and later worked in the kitchens of a noble household in Paris. She was a master of a craft that became a death sentence. She had been exiled. She was cast out into the cold of a shifting world. She had not taught Martha to cook to serve the rich. She had taught her so that Martha would always carry the tools of a queen. Even in the skin of a peasant, she was royalty. I realized then why Martha's food tasted like a memory. It was a memory of a place she had never seen. It was her resistance. It was her way of keeping her mother alive. Her kitchen was made of rough-hewn pine, but her spirit was forged in the Tuileries. Every loaf of bread was a monument. Every stew was a prayer for a mother who died on a ship. Perhaps she died in a crowded tenement. I heard the back door creak open. Martha stood there. Her apron was stained with wood ash. Her hands were raw from the winter's bite. She saw the box in my lap. She saw the letter in my hand. She did not move. The air in this kitchen grew thick. It was charged with the sudden weight of the truth. Her eyes went to the empty corner. Her cabinets were gone. She had burned her only physical link to that life. She did it to save mine. Now, all that remained was this box of paper. Only the skills in her fingertips were left. I did not ask her why she hid it. I saw the answer in the way she stood. Her shoulders were tight. She was waiting for the rejection. In this valley, a woman with a past like hers was a target. Gossip and suspicion were the currency here. The daughter of a political exile did not belong. A woman who knew the secrets of a palace was a stranger. This was a pig-iron town. I stood up. My knees cracked in the quiet room. I did not put the box back. I walked over to her. I placed the iron box on the kitchen table. It looked small and lonely against the scarred wood. "You don't have to hide the fire anymore, Martha," I said softly. The silence stretched between us. It was fragile as a spun sugar bird. She looked at the letter. Her lip trembled just enough to show the crack in her armor. "I thought it would make me a stranger to you, she whispered. Her voice was thin. It was like the wind through a keyhole. I reached out and took her hand. Her skin was rough and hard-working. "You were never a stranger," I replied. "I just didn't know how much of your heart you were using to feed me." She leaned her forehead against my chest. Her breath came in short, jagged hitches. The secrets were out of now. They were sitting on the table in the light of a cold Pennsylvania morning. The woman who had survived the flood was finally standing on solid ground. She was not a refugee of a fallen empire. She was the mistress of this house. The flavor of her love was no longer a mystery to be feared. It was a gift to be guarded. I felt the tension leave her body. It was replaced by a weary, profound relief. The box remained open. The past was no longer under the floorboards. It was part of the room. The iron box sat on the pine table like a heavy anchor. It seemed to pull the very air out of the kitchen. Martha did not move from the doorway. Her hands were still tucked into the folds of her ash-stained apron. The silence was not the soft kind. It was sharp, jagged, and cold. I looked from the faded portrait to the woman standing before me. 10 years, Martha, I said. My voice sounded like dry leaves skittering across a porch. 10 years of eating your bread and sleeping by your side. And all that time, you were keeping a ghost under the floorboards. I touched the corner of the letter. The paper was brittle as an old bone. Martha finally stepped into the room. The floorboards groaned under her weight. I had heard that sound 1,000 times, but today it felt like a crack in a frozen lake. "I didn't keep a ghost, Arthur," she whispered. "I kept a life that was meant to be over." She walked to the table but did not sit. She looked at the letter as if it might bite her. "My mother died during the siege," she said. Her eyes were fixed on the far wall. "In 1871, when the Prussians surrounded Paris, there was no food. People ate the animals in the zoo. They ate the rats from the gutters. But my mother, she made a soup from nettles and hope. She told me that as long as we kept the recipes, we kept our dignity. She said that a person who can create beauty in a wasteland is never truly a slave." I looked at her hands. They were the hands of a laborer. They were scarred by grease and knives. They were the same hands that had held back the cold. "Is that why you never complained?" I asked. "Is that why you worked until your fingers bled in this dirt?" Martha looked at me then. Her eyes were bright with unshed tears. "I did it because I loved you, Arthur. But I also did it because I was afraid. I was afraid that if you knew where I came from, you would see me as a relic, a piece of fine china in a blacksmith's shop. I didn't want to be a curiosity. I wanted to be your wife." The weight of her words hit me in the chest. I thought of the sacrifices she had made. I thought of the night before. She had burned the very tools of her heritage. She had thrown the carvings of her past into the stove. She did it to keep my blood moving. She had chosen my life over her history. "You are not China, Martha," I said. I stepped toward her. "You are the iron that holds this house together." I took the letter and folded it carefully. I placed it back into the rusted box. "The world in this letter is gone," I continued. "Paris is a memory. The courts are dust, but the woman who survived them is standing right here. And she is the bravest person I've ever known." Martha let out a sob. It was a sound of 10 years of held breath. It was the sound of a wall collapsing. She fell into my arms. I held her as the sun finally broke through the clouds. The light hit the kitchen table. It turned the rust on the box to gold. "Justice is a strange thing," I whispered into her hair. "The world tried to take everything from you. It tried to make you a shadow, but you made yourself a sun. You fed a man who had nothing. You built a home out of ash. That is the only dignity that matters." We stood there for a long time. The mud outside would dry. The floor would be repaired. The box would no longer be a secret. It would be a foundation. During the weeks that followed, we rebuilt more slowly than I wanted and more carefully than we ever had before. The storm had damaged the roof above the kitchen. One barn door had been torn from its hinges. 3 sections of fence lay buried beneath the melting drifts. The cattle had survived, though one steer walked with a limp until early April. Every morning, Martha and I stepped outside with shovels, hammers, and whatever strength the previous day had left us. The snow softened, then it collapsed. Water ran from the hills in silver threads and gathered in the low fields. Mud swallowed our boots to the ankles. The world looked wounded, but alive. I built new kitchen shelves from plain maple. Martha did not ask me to carve them like the cherry cabinets. She only asked that I make them deep enough for her flour crocks and strong enough to hold the iron pots. On the day I hung the last shelf, she stood in the doorway watching me. "You have measured that board 4 times, she said. "I want it straight. It is a shelf, Arthur. You once stopped me from placing an oak brace across a carved vine." A faint smile appeared. "That was different." "Why?" "Because the vine mattered." I stepped down from the stool. "And this does not..." She looked around the repaired kitchen. The new boards were pale. The old walls were darkened by years of smoke. The floor still carried a black mark where the cherry cabinets had burned. "It matters, she said, "but it does not need to pretend to be anything more than a shelf." I understood. The old cabinets had carried a history. The new shelves carried a future. By the middle of April, the road to Crestfall reopened. Ruth Harlan arrived in a wagon with Mrs. Whitmore and 2 farm boys. They brought a bundle of split wood, a sack of flour, and a pane of glass for the window the storm had broken. Mrs. Gable came last. She stood near the gate holding a covered dish. For once, she had no questions. "Though I brought chicken pie," she said. Martha accepted it. "Thank you." Mrs. Gable looked at the repaired roof and the blackened corner of the kitchen visible through the open door. "We heard what you burned." Martha's expression did not change. "Wood." Mrs. Gable lowered her eyes. "Some said those cabinets were valuable." "They were." "And you burned them anyway." Martha glanced toward me. "He was more valuable." The woman had no answer. She placed the dish on the table and left before supper. That evening, our neighbors sat in the kitchen on crates, stools, and an overturned milk pail. Martha served beef stew, fresh bread, and Mrs. Gable's pie. She used ordinary wooden spoons for everyone. The silver spoon remains inside the iron box. No one asked about it. No one asked about France. They spoke of fences, seed prices, lost telegraph poles, and the family still digging out farther east. It was the first meal in 10 years when Martha sat among the people of Crestfall without being examined. She was not the river woman. She was not a countess, a fugitive, or a mystery. She was the woman who had kept her husband alive through the storm. When the neighbors left, Ruth touched Martha's shoulder. "Next Sunday, the churchwomen are preparing food for the families near the mill. We could use someone who knows how to stretch a little meat." Martha looked toward me. I said nothing. The decision belonged to her. "I will come," she replied. The following Sunday, she stood in the church kitchen beside women who had once whispered about her. She showed them how to brown onions slowly, how to thicken broth without wasting flour, and how to turn 2 chickens into enough stew for 20 people. Mrs. Whitmore watched her work. "Who taught you to cook that way?" she asked. The room fell quiet. Martha's hand stopped over the pot. I was standing near the door carrying firewood. For one terrible second, I saw the old fear return. Then she looked toward me. I did not rescue her. I simply stayed. Martha turned back to the women. My mother. Nothing broke. No one laughed. Ruth nodded. She taught you well. Martha resumed stirring. That was all. The answer she had protected for so many years entered the room and did not destroy her. It became only a sentence, only a truth, only a mother remembered beside a warm stove. When we returned home, the sun was setting over the wet fields. Martha removed the silver spoon from the iron box and carried it to the table. She placed it beside my wooden bowl. I looked at it. You are using it. She shook her head. You are… For what? The stew. I picked up the spoon. The engraved lily caught the last light from the window. It no longer looked like an object from a palace. It looked like something that had crossed an ocean, survived a flood, slept beneath a floor, and finally reached the place where it belonged. I took one bite. Martha waited. It is good, I said. Only good. Better than the grand hotel in town. She laughed. The sound filled the kitchen without fear. I set down the spoon and reached for her hand. Now it belongs here. Martha looked at the spoon, then at the shelves, then at the dark scar left on the floor by the cabinets. No, she said softly. I belong here. I closed my fingers around hers. Outside, the Susquehanna moved beneath the evening light. The river still carried branches, mud, and pieces of winter toward the sea, but it no longer held her name. It no longer held our future. The house smelled of bread, broth, and new maple. The iron box remained open on the table. Martha's mother was no longer hidden beneath the floor. She lived in the careful turn of a spoon. She lived in the food Martha carried to hungry families. She lived in the courage her daughter had finally found to speak. I raised the silver spoon again. Martha sat across from me, no longer silent because she was afraid. She was quiet because peace had finally entered the room. And for the first time, I understood the difference. I looked at the portrait one last time. The woman in the lace seemed to be smiling now. She was no longer exhausted. She was proud. Her daughter had found a way to win She had found a way to be a queen in a kitchen of pine, as she had found a man who didn't want her history. He wanted her. What happens now? Martha asked. She wiped her eyes with the corner of her apron. I looked at the stove. I looked at the empty cupboards. Now, I said, we rebuild. And tonight, we eat. Not like peasants. Not like refugees. We eat like people who have survived the end of the world, Martha smiled. It was the first real smile I had seen since the first snowflake fell. It was a victory, and the storm had taken much. It had taken the wood and the warmth. But it had given us the truth, and the truth was the only thing worth saving. The Pennsylvania morning was cold. But for the first time in my life, I felt truly warm. I took her hand. We walked toward the door. The world was waiting. And we were ready for it. Because we were the beauty that remained. We were the fire that wouldn't go out. We were the heart of the storm. And we were finally home. The iron box remained on the table. It was an anchor no longer. It was a witness. The shadows in the room retreated. The light took hold of every corner. The legacy of a chef from Paris and a laborer from the valley was joined. It was a new recipe. It was the taste of endurance. It was the smell of a life well lived. And in the weeks that followed, as the last of the snow slowly melted into the mud, I knew we had not just survived the winter. We had conquered it. Martha leaned against me. Her strength was quiet but absolute. Thank you, Arthur, she whispered. For what? I asked us. For seeing me, she said. I kissed her forehead. I've always seen you, Martha. I just finally learned how to look. The kitchen was quiet, the world was new, and we were the only ones who knew the price of the dawn. But it was a price we would pay again, 1,000 times over, for the love that was forged in the fire and the truth that was found in the mud. The letter was still there, the portrait was still there, but they were just paper and ink. The real story was the woman in my arms, and the man who finally understood her heart. The silence was gone. The music of the morning began. It was the sound of a shovel hitting the earth. It was the sound of a new day, and it was beautiful. We walked out into the light. The mud was deep, but our feet were steady. We had each other. And that was more than enough. It was everything. The iron box stayed on the table, open and free, just like us.